So here is a sort of favorite cartoon I've discovered, because during the pandemic, as I was explaining to Tara, I've kind of gotten into Marie Kondo a little bit. I thought this was great. Why do we still have the Electoral College? Does it spark joy? And as you know, with Marie Kondo, if it doesn't spark joy, you're supposed to get rid of it. So we should think about that as we consider this question. And the topic tonight, these are the two sort of extremes you might think of. Is it a loaded pistol pointed at our system of government, which is what one of the advocates for getting rid of it in 1972 said about it, or is it an unappreciated bulwark protecting states from the federal government? And those are sort of the two positions that one might take about this. So it might be useful just quickly to be reminded of the timeline of the Electoral College.
I don't certainly want to hog the dance floor, but I do have a question. In part, again, of course, the southern states were underpopulated, and then, the 3/5 of a person, all that other stuff of trying to, make sure the rural states had it. But now, I believe, over 50% of US citizens live in cities. And my brother-in-law, who is a Trumpian, you don't pick your in-laws, he says that, yeah, it's a good thing we have the Electoral College, otherwise it'd be the president of the United Cities of America. That was his snide comment. But I mean, the thing is that if people want to live in cities, I mean, I do believe in one person, one vote. And anyway.
Well, that is one of the many myths. The fact is that the cities would not dominate the Electoral College, and that's what next week we're going to talk about the different options for getting change. But essentially the argument for getting rid of it is that in fact everybody's vote would count. And I've lived in well, Mark, you and I've talked about this before. A Republican's vote in Hawaii doesn't count. A Democrat's vote in Alaska doesn't count. But it would if it were a national popular vote, because they would want every single vote for their party wherever it lived, right? And so
right. Now, I'm not saying that all cities are Democrat, of course, and not all city rurals are Republican.
But so it's not that way. The fact is there aren't enough people, even in California and New York, if it's not just going to be that. So we'll get to that next week, okay? But thank you. Anybody else who wants to ask a question or make a comment? You don't have to have a name. Your name doesn't have to be Stitham. Or Rudd. Okay. Well, then I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. Excuse me, the historical situation. Okay, you guys can see this? Checking? Always checking? Yes? Thumbs up? Okay. So why? What's the situation? As you heard in the video, kind of made reference to it. This was the situation in 1787 when the convention was held. So you look at this very small, sort of hovered along the eastern seaboard. Obviously, we knew that part. The settled areas, you notice that Maine is only partially settled up there. Of course, it's part of Massachusetts, which is always very annoying to have to acknowledge until 1820, right? But look around. At the top, you have three superpowers, European superpowers, that had been obviously influential in the colonizing at the beginning, but also in Canada, you've got Britain. It now belongs to Britain, Great Britain, having defeated the French in the war of, in the French Indian War, as we call it, but the 7 Years' War. And then you look, France still controlled large swaths, allegedly, the French Courrier de Bois and all the folks off to the west, and the Louisiana Territory, Spain, the Spanish Florida. Spain, of course, eventually was taken over by Napoleon in the early part of the 1800s. And so, it's Spanish and French, but each of them, they were eager to see this experiment fail, to capture it. And there were all kinds of soldiers in the area of the Northwest Territory. The British did not withdraw after the Revolutionary War. There were Spanish soldiers up and down here. So it was a very tenuous situation. On top of that, we had the Articles of Confederation, which were the governing document. And the Articles of Confederation was a very, very weak read. It was signed in 1777 and governed essentially up to 1787, but there were many flaws. It had no executive at all. The president, so the first presidents of the United States technically were the presidents of the Confederation Congresses. technically. That's why George Washington isn't really the first president. It's one of those trivial pursuit questions. Now you all know the answer and will get a lot of money. I will be willing to be your lifeline if you get on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. I'm just saying, if that's your topic. The second real big flaw was that there was no revenue. They had no possibility of raising revenue. Whatever a state chose to donate to the common cause, that was it. And the third really big problem, they could only make a decision by unanimous vote of all 13. Now, if you've been on any organization's board, as I know some of you have been, unanimous votes are hard to come by if you're talking about anything except when should we have recess, you know, in 4th grade or whatever. So basically, and they had these 3 hostile nations on every border. They had no basic defense. And the states started competing and arguing with one another. There were actually armed conflicts between Virginia and Pennsylvania over their border, between tariffs. So there were, and several of the other states were equally done. And then, of course, they all claimed out into the West, on the Northwest Territory and other places. So it was a recipe for a disaster. And people like Alexander Hamilton, young people, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and also George Washington, became increasingly alarmed by what was happening. So I want to show you what a difference to me that the preamble to the Articles of Confederation and the preamble to the United States Constitution, very significant difference in wording. So this is the preamble to the Articles that were signed in 1777. To all to whom these presents shall come, we the undersigned delegates of the states affixed to our names send greeting. Whereas the delegates of the United States of America in Congress assembled did on the 15th day of November in the year of our Lord, 1777, and the 2nd year of the independence of America, agree to certain articles of confederation and perpetual union between the states. So that's what the Confederation articles said, perpetual union, but you'll notice undersigned delegates of the states. Look at the incredibly important 3 words that James Wilson and the others from his subcommittee wrote for the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States. So it's we the states, we the people. And so it's an enormous change, which they didn't actually all understand the consequences of at the time that they wrote it, but it has been enormously significant in that. So clearly something had to happen. The Confederation was not working. And so the framers, the distinction, by the way, between founders and framers is important at this particular time. The founders, some of the founders were framers, but not all of them, and not all the framers were founders. Because essentially, the founders are the people from the revolution itself, the Continental Congresses, and the people who organized and fought the war against the British. The framers are those men who were at the Constitutional Convention. So 2 people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, major founders, were not framers. They were not at the convention. Adams was representing the government in London, and Jefferson was in France, as you know. I often think Jefferson wrote frequently across the Atlantic, month-long letters to Madison, was very much in connection with Madison, but they weren't there. I think it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened had they been, particularly Jefferson, who was not a big fan of the new document when it came out, if you've done any reading about him. But all of these, particularly Hamilton and George Washington and Madison, they knew that something had to be changed. And so they were successful at, and they were members of the Confederation Congress, not Washington, he'd gone home. But they succeeded in getting the Confederation Congress to pass a bill saying, we want you to go into convention, to call a convention of the states, and we want you to fix the Confederation Charter. Fix it, amend it. They did not say, we would like you to throw it out the window and write a brand new document. But pretty much Hamilton and Madison knew that's what they were going to have to do because it was such a flawed document, right? But anyway, their official charter was to simply have a meeting and fix the flaws in the document. And they knew, those 2 guys, that they had to have Washington, that Washington had to be persuaded to be the president of this convention. And in fact, he was very reluctant. And the thing about Washington, if you haven't read about him, I had such a bad idea about Washington from, the bad teeth. And I just don't feel that until I graduated from, I retired and started reading American history, I really had a lot of ideas, I think, that came to me from the landmark books and from my elementary school about what history was all about. And Washington just seems super boring. He is far from, now, Any of you who've been involved in politics, small p, with meetings and people drafting up very important documents know that if you're not at the table, it's a very bad mistake because you will not be in the conversation. So these guys, like some famous ones you might recognize, Patrick Henry refused to go. John Hancock refused to go because Patrick Henry said, "I smell a rat." There was George Mason refused. No, Doug Mason did go actually, but there were some people who did not want. They didn't want a strong federal government. They liked it the way it was. They liked the separation of the states being, more of a confederation, and they feared that we were trying to head towards some kind of monarchy or whatever. And so they refused to come to the table, so they weren't there. Rhode Island refused to come at all. They sent no one to the convention because they were very happy. In fact, some of their colleagues used to call them Rogue Island. They were very happy, and they also were the last to ratify. They didn't ratify until the end of 1789. Or it was 1790. Washington was already president. They weren't even part of the first election because they were so reluctant to join this new country, and that's partly because they really liked printing their own money. That was one of the things that was happening. Every state legislature was printing its own money, which is another one of the huge economic problems that the country had. And so they didn't want to stop that. And so they finally reluctantly had to, of course, join, but they didn't want to be there. So they weren't at the table. So what you have is a group of men of pretty much a common mind that something had to be done because the people who didn't think so weren't there. And these men knew each other. A lot of them knew each other well. They'd served together in the previous Congresses. They were in the Confederation Congress. Some of them had been governors of their states and involved. So they knew each other. And they also had a very similar education, most of them. They'd read the same books. They were all very influenced by the Whig thinkers in Britain. They'd read, Montesquieu and Locke. And they were youthful, but very experienced in that regard. And so the fear was on the people who didn't go there, that they didn't want an energetic government. So that, however, was what James Madison did want. So he brought the Virginia Plan to the convention in May of 1787. And you also know, if you've been in any kind of small p political movements, you know that if you work from your own document, if somebody's you don't start with a blank slate. If you've got something you want the group to agree to, right? You start with a draft. And so he came in with a whole all thought out. He'd been reading for a year, James Madison, all the previous republics in Greece, Rome. He'd read everybody. And so he brought this thing, boom, here it is. Now, they never intended a democracy. I think that's really important for us as we think about the undemocratic nature of the Electoral College, because it is undemocratic without doubt. But they never intended a democracy at all, any of them. They had a real fear of mob rule, the tyranny of the majority, but they also had a fear of the king, of monarchy. And so they were looking for a balance between these things. But they came up with what is called a constitutional republic. So we are not a direct democracy the way New England town meetings are, the way Dover Foxcroft used to have. I'm so sorry it doesn't anymore, because I think it was wonderful, right in Central Hall. I remember going to them. And so that's direct democracy, where everybody votes personally, right? What we have is representative democracy, a constitutional democracy. So you elect your representatives, and that's what they intended. So for 4 months, they met till September 17th. It was super hot in Philadelphia, if you've ever been there in the summer. It was hot, muggy, and they nailed the windows shut, as you probably know. They wanted no leaks, right? Nobody had their phones. They had to leave them outside. Becca, I want you to make a note of that. They did not get their phones in there. And they were not allowed to take any notes. No one could take any notes except James Madison. He was the official note taker. He is the person he's the only record that we have is his record of what he wrote. And it wasn't published until he died in 1836. So it was meant to be, and everybody sort of swore themselves to secrecy. The brilliance of that and the miracle of it, I mean, today we would say they're meeting behind closed doors in smoke-filled rooms, and this is a terrible thing. The brilliance of it was that people could try out ideas. They could make compromises without fearing being totally beaten to death by the people who had sent them there. They could use their judgments as delegates and not as simply just pass through for a vote somebody told you to do back at home. And so that really was amazing. And one of the stories that Madison wrote was that Washington, like I said, they weren't supposed to take any notes. One day they found a note on the floor when everybody had left, that someone had been taking, and it was on the floor. Washington the next day, when they all came reassembled, he just had to look at him, and he's like that teacher we all had, right? That just gives you that look like, I cannot believe you're broken my heart by doing this. This is so wrong. And they all just felt terrible, and nobody admitted who done it, but they never did it again. And so it was completely kept a secret until the 17th of September when they came out. So they had several bones of contention, if you will, right? One of the big ones was representation in the legislature. They knew that was the first thing they had to do, was have the legislature. So the large states and the small states, this was the problem, right? And the big worry they had was the large states, which were like Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, that these states were going to dominate everything. And yeah, and Virginia, like I said, right? Virginia was really the biggest one. And so how are we going to have this checks and balances? How are we going to get this balance that we must have? So the composition of the Senate, as you all know, was established as part of the Connecticut Compromise, if you remember. They agreed the House would be every 2 years, close to the people, elected for 2-year terms, and it would reflect the population in the state. But the Senate, every state would get two senators, no matter what their size. And that was meant to be the compromise here. Washington told, and they're 6-year terms, right? So they'd be less influenced by mob and popular opinion and whatever. So Washington told Madison that it was like the tea, that the Senate would be the saucer in which the hot tea could be cooled. So the hot ideas of the public that are all boiling in the House would get cooled in the Senate with the deliberation by this. Now, the senators at this point were chosen by the state legislatures. So the Senate represented the states. That's what it was. The House represented the people. The Senate represented the states. That was the theory behind this setup. And it was meant to be, again, this balancing thing, right? It was the great compromise. And one of the things that Franklin added was that that revenue bills would start in the House. That was a really big feature in supporting it, because that means that the money, the taxation, has to come from the people's house, if you will, which is still the case. It has to be in there. Now, here's the problem, of course, the 3/5 Compromise, which everybody knows about, which is one of the shameful blots on our history, which was how are they going to count the slaves, right? How are they going to count the enslaved persons in the southern states? This was a huge problem. There were a number of options out there. What finally came up was the number that Madison came up with as a compromise, which was 3/5. So every enslaved person counted on 3/5 for purpose of determining how many representatives you got in the House. But of course, they couldn't vote. So this had a huge impact in increasing the influence of southern states, obviously, right? They're getting more representation, but fewer people are voting for those people, right? So it was a huge gift, if you will, to the southern states. But had they not done that, everybody says there would not have been a constitution, because the South would have left. They would not have accepted anything else, basically, some kind of acknowledgement of that. So that stayed in there as a poison pill in the Constitution until finally the Civil War fixed that, right? Now, what that meant was they had a huge influence in the House. It also meant they had an influence in the Electoral College, right? Because that's based on your representation in the House plus your 2 senators. So they had a disproportionate influence, southern states, in picking the president, and they had a disproportionate influence. That meant also in the judiciary, like the Supreme Court, because the president nominates the Supreme Court, as we know. So they had a disproportionate influence everywhere except in the Senate, which is 2 for every state, right? So that's the impact of the 3/5 Compromise. Interestingly, Washington, when he was looking at the work that they had done, he really felt that what was going to happen to the country, the problem with it, none of them, by the way, thought this was going to last very long. They were really anxious about it, whether it would really be solid and stay there. But he was concerned that there would be a split, not between large states and small states, but between North and South. He saw that already coming. And he was a Virginian and a planter, as you probably know. But what he said in this letter was, and if it were to come to that, I would be with the North, which was very interesting since he was a slave owner himself. But as you also probably know, he did prepare all of his slaves for crafts, for trades, and he made sure that they were freed following the death of his wife, which isn't as great as not having slaves at all, but it's better than a whole bunch of his contemporaries did about their slaves. Okay, so the direct election of the Senate changed in 1913. When we got the fact that the people of the state now vote for senators starting in 1913. So there was a 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed. but it really didn't change the problem. Because the problem is, just like the Electoral College, and we're going to talk for a minute about the Senate is an undemocratic institution. It was intended to be undemocratic, right? Because it wasn't representative. It's 2 per state, no matter what your size was. They knew that at the beginning, but by the time we get to 2016, it's pretty incredible. This is what in 2016, the disproportionate nature of our Senate. In 2016, 62 senators, and here she is right there. Look at Susan Collins right in the front in a nice red dress. 2016, 62 senators represented 25% of the people in the United States. So did these 6 senators. They represented 25% of the people in the country. Okay, incredible, right? Then look at this. This is again 2016 data, but look at this is kind of relates to Mark's question about the impact of people's votes. Here's Maine. For every senator, each of the 2 senators of Maine represents 660,000 people, right? In California, each senator represents 19 million people. I mean, that's an extraordinary difference, right? Absolutely extraordinary. In the 2021 Senate, the Democratic senators right now represent 41.5 million more citizens than the Republicans, which is 12.5% of the population. The Republican senators together, which are 50, it's a 50-50 Senate, right? Represent 43% of the citizens. And so that is part of the issue. And the second piece of the undemocratic nature, you all recognize Jimmy Stewart here, is the filibuster, which has been in the news greatly right now. And the filibuster is a Senate procedure. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in a law. It's just a process, a procedure, a rule of the Senate, which could be changed. The House still has, a majority of the House can vote to stop debate and bring a vote to the floor. In the Senate, the filibuster means that it takes 60 votes, 60 of 100, to stop debate and bring a vote to the floor, bring a motion to the floor. And that is what has happened and brought a lot of things to a halt. And the picture here, of course, Jimmy Stewart in his great, they used to have talking filibusters. And as you all are aware now, they in the 90s, they stopped having the talking. You could just say, I'm going to filibuster. One of the reforms being talked about right now is to make the senators stand up on the floor and actually do the talking again, instead of not doing that. But here, of course, is Jimmy Stewart in the famous, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. So I'm going to go back to talking about the executive, and I really want, you'll recognize his glasses from the video, but this is James Wilson, and he deserves a lot more exposure. He's a guy that did a lot, and he's hardly known by anybody outside I suppose, the people who enjoy reading about all this stuff in great detail. But James Wilson had an enormous amount to do. He was the founder. He's a founder and a framer. He was on the Committee of Detail, which was the committee that got to really write the first draft of everything. And then he was in the first group of justices appointed to the Supreme Court. And he was on the Supreme Court from 1789 to 1798. And get this, he actually got to give lectures on the Constitution to George Washington and his cabinet about how the Constitution was going to work, which is a pretty cool deal. Anyway, so he's important because of he was extremely well respected in the convention, and so had a lot to say about what was going on. So one of the things was, as you learned, he wanted a popular vote for the president. That just did not go anywhere. It would have been, of course, when it says popular, we mean adult white men who have property, right? We're not talking about everybody, of course. But in some states, it still would have been like 70% of the people. So it was a lot more than had ever happened before in the history of the world, basically. But the options were things like, what are we going to do? Who's going to be, we don't want a king. We know we don't want a king. So how do we avoid having a king? So should Congress pick it? And you saw that in the video. No. Don't want this person independent. We don't want the state legislatures to pick it. Absolutely not. We don't want the judiciary to pick it. We don't want a committee like they had in Pennsylvania. They had 3 people running in Pennsylvania when it was a colony in its early statehood. And we don't want the state governors choosing this person. We want them independent of any other elected body. And so he was advocating the popular vote. On July 17th, Madison spoke in favor of the popular vote, but he also said the South will never accept this because of the Negroes, is what he said, because of they would never permit the popular vote because they wanted the indirect election. They wanted that disproportionate influence that they had in the House, and so basically the compromise was the college, the Electoral College. Jefferson, for example, was definitely not a fan of popular vote. He wrote to somebody who was working on the Virginia Constitution, "I have often observed that a choice by the people themselves is not generally distinguished for its wisdom." So he might say the same thing about us as well. We are not necessarily better, although we could be better informed. We're not necessarily better informed, but one person, one vote has come to be one of our fundamental principles in terms of our representations. Let me tell you about Wilson just quickly. He's a Scottish. He was born in Scotland. He went to St. Andrews. He was a golfer, which some of you might find charming about him. In 1767, he was 25. He came to the United States. He was a lawyer. He studied with John Dickinson, who was a delegate to the Congress, a lawyer in Pennsylvania. He signed the Declaration, and at the convention, he wrote the first draft, as I said. So he basically was the principal architect of the executive branch. And when they went back to the ratification, he gave a very important speech, which was probably more influential in some ways than the Federalist Papers. It's called the State House Yard speech in Pennsylvania, which was reprinted in papers all across the country. But he and the rest of the majority opposed a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, including Madison. You probably know that. And they did that not because they were against the rights. Many states had their own Bill of Rights in their state constitutions, but they really felt that if the concern they had was that if you enumerate rights and you don't list all of them, then the ones you haven't listed, people will say you don't have. So that was the way they were thinking. Now, obviously, what happened is the Bill of Rights were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution because there were states that refused to ratify without a Bill of Rights. And so Madison, ironically, was the one in the Congress who carried those, actually drafted them and carried them to and through to success in the House, and came to see that they were important. They were important, but he still felt intellectually that they weren't needed. But of course, I think he was wrong on that. So what they saw the Electoral College as, you guys, was like a sort of pop-up Congress, right? It was going to be specifically elected just for the purpose of choosing, debating, and choosing the best person to be president, and then it disappeared, right? They were going to be independent, a sort of college. Now, that's the same thing that they were smart enough to do for the ratification, because Madison and Hamilton definitely did not want this new Congress to go back to state legislatures. This new Constitution to go back to state legislatures to be approved of, because there was not much trust about the state legislatures who'd refused to send money to support the Confederation. And so they put in there, in this totally brand new thing that they created, they weren't authorized to do, they put in that it was going to go to each state convention with people elected specifically for that purpose. And so when they ran for the state conventions, they basically said, you either voted for them because you knew they were a wise person and you trusted their judgment, or some people ran saying, I'm going to vote for this, and other people ran saying, I'm going to vote against it. And so they had people specifically elected to be there. So we will come to that in a moment. But I want to just look at what it was that they came up with here in terms of this. This is the Article 2, Section 1, the executive, that was the language they took to the people. Okay, so the important point here is this is the Electoral College. Notice the word Electoral College is not included in the Constitution. That isn't a term. It wasn't used until, I think it wasn't used until 1845. So each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. Pay attention to that. That is really important. It became important in the Supreme Court case in July of this past year. A number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. That's part of the independence. You can't be a government employee and be an elector. You can't be an elected person in the federal government and be an elector. You can't be an assistant postmaster and be an elector, which became important in Oregon in 1876. The electors shall meet in their respective states, Part 3, and vote by ballot for two persons, one of whom cannot be from their state, right? That's still the law. And they shall make a list and of the number of votes, and they'll sign and certify and transmit it, directed to the President of the Senate. And then the President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate, House of Representatives open all the certificates. That was what was happening on January 6th, right? Then continued, person having the greatest number of votes shall be the president if it is a majority of the number of electors. If there's more than one who have such majority or have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for president. And if no person has a majority, then from the 5 highest, the said House shall in like manner choose the president. Okay, so they put a contingency election in here, right? So if somebody doesn't get a majority, if no one has a majority in their Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives. If there's a tie, as there was in 1800, both of whom had a majority, but it's a tie, it goes to the House of Representatives. But note how even more undemocratic, if you will, what happens in the House is. Once you get to the House, 1 vote per state. California gets a vote, Alaska gets a vote, Maine gets a vote, Florida gets a vote, right? 1 vote. And if the people who in the House of Representatives representing that state can't agree, they tie, then it's 0. They don't get a vote. Okay, so that's the process, and that was the process in the Constitution as it was originally implemented. Okay, so the question is there the key thing to gather from that is everything is left to the states. Everything about this, except what's written there, is left to the states about elections that have to do with the federal government, and that is something that is significant. We do not have a federal election system, although we have a federal election. So checks and balances, which they were after, right? I love these little 2 cartoons. So we got Madison over here. You must first enable the government to control the governed. In the next place, oblige it to control itself. And then the question about the Electoral College. Is it a pillar of democracy? Is it part of this? You should remember that what the Electoral College was intended to be was a group of men, statesmen in each state who would get together and think and talk about the candidates and deliberate and choose somebody. That's what they had in mind. Is pretty clear. It never ever worked like that. In Federalist 68, if you read your homework, you could see what it was that Hamilton said about it. There have been hundreds of amendments offered, starting in 1804 with the 12th Amendment, which actually changed it. And clearly, it's it's the part of the Constitution that most people have had the most trouble with throughout the years. But remember also that Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And the fact is, we're not angels. We have flaws. We need the checks and balances. The question for us is the Electoral College still, did it ever function as part of the checks and balances system in a good way? And if it did, does it still? That's the question. Okay, so I want to stop now and see if anybody has a comment, and then I want to talk about the Electoral College a little bit more here about the winner take all. Any comments so far?
I have a question, Susan.
Sure. Yes.
I'm just wondering if this might be in the future series, but if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between ranked choice voting and the process of the Electoral College and kind of where that comes in to that process that you just reviewed.
First of all, kudos to Maine. Ranked choice voting is brilliant, and it should be everywhere. And you probably know that Alaska did adopt it, and they did you one better in one sense, because they got rid of party primaries in the sense that there's the top 4 who are in there, kind of like the California top 2 and the Washington top 2. Do you know that? In their statewide elections are in what the final election, and it's ranked choice voting in Alaska. So, and I think yours is wonderful, and I wish we had it here. How does it connect to the Electoral College? I have to think about that, Tara, a little bit, because you used it for president, right? You used it in the presidential election in Maine, right? Because I know it wasn't for governor, but it was for the president, right?
Yeah, it was for the president in this recent election.
It would be interesting if you had 3 candidates, because it's only relevant when you've got you've got more than 2, and because this country pretty much the Electoral College benefits a 2-party system. Without doubt, the 2 major parties benefit from the Electoral College, and so what you've done with ranked choice voting is made it possible for people to vote for 3rd-party candidates or for independents and not feel like you're losing your vote. You can have your second choice go to the person that's probably more likely to win. But so I'm not sure how it would directly relate to Electoral College, because there's there have been some third-party candidates that have gotten electoral votes, not very many over the years. I'll think some more about it. Mark seems to have an answer or a question
No, no.
or
I don't
comment.
have the answer. No, I was just kind of thought it through. I was thinking some people automatically sort of just say, oh, ranked choice. What's happened to one man, one vote? They shouldn't do that because you're getting more than one vote. But no, you're not. Your vote is still just a one, whether it's maybe the second choice. The other thing was that I really do, though, think that Maine and Nebraska has done a good thing. The winner take all, I don't think is I think splitting it by the district or whatever. Is it by the district? I think.
Yes,
What is it?
yes, we're going to talk about that right now. Thanks for leading into that, Mark. That was really
I
good.
segue to my sister. Ta-da!
All right, passing it off. So the winner take all has made the Electoral College much less democratic than it was. And Mark, you may or may not know that the framers in their minds thought it was going to be by the district, like Maine and like Nebraska, but they didn't write that in. They just had an assumption that that was how it was going to be. And when it turned out not to be that way, even Jefferson was like, well, it would be better if it were, but since everyone else is going, just like the video showed you, what we have to too. If we're going to lose our clout if we can't give our whole bunch, if we're a big state and we've got a bunch of electoral votes, then people pay attention to us. We saw this in the last election with all of the so-called swing states, right? Which are, in most cases, states with a pile of electoral votes that people really want, right? And it's where it's closely divided. So that was one of the issues. But I want to talk about winner take all. It was never intended to be winner take all. It wasn't written down that way. And as I just told you, the assumptions will be congressional districts. Maine did this, by the way, in 1972. Kudos to Maine. And Nebraska in 1992. And I'm not entirely sure what all their thinking was there, but it was well thought, because it does get closer to a more proportional distribution of the votes. Now, as an answer to wanting it to become, it's not as good as a popular vote if what you want is every vote counts equally in every single part of the country because of gerrymandering. One of the things we have is very bad gerrymandering in many states. Both parties have done it and do it. And it distorts, right, the popular vote. And also you have, just by necessity, you've got districts that are more or less the same number, but not the exact same number. And so even if it were done by a machine, it's still not going to be the same as one person counts. Every vote counts exactly the same, no matter where you cast it. So that's one thing to say. So I want to say that yes, Jefferson said on the subject of an election by a general ticket, that's the statewide winner take all. Most people here seem to have taken up their minds. He wrote to James Monroe from Washington, made up their minds. All agree that election by districts would be best if it could be general. But while most states choose by the legislatures or a general ticket, it's folly and worse than folly for the other states not to do it. Madison was so unhappy about this in the 1820s, he proposed a constitutional amendment to require district voting, like Maine and Nebraska. That didn't go anywhere, obviously. He wasn't in Congress anymore. But anyway, he was very upset about it. So what was the impact of the Three-Fifths Compromise on this? I think you'll hear people saying the Electoral College protects slavery. The Electoral College was a pro-slavery kind of thing. The historians basically still argue about all that, but there definitely was an advantage, without doubt. And the Southerners, as I said, definitely dominated at first. Now, there weren't parties yet, right? But there were factions in the sense of affinal groups, if you will. And by 1850, the North and South had split into parties that were very different. But the Southern, in 1828, Jackson really benefited from the three-fifths advantage and won the presidency in 1828. Jefferson won in 1800. He definitely benefited from Virginia, the Three-Fifths Compromise in Virginia. In 1788, Virginia had a quarter of the votes needed to win. Virginia alone had a quarter of the electoral votes needed to win the election. Following the 1790 census, they still had that advantage. Pennsylvania had 10% more free citizens than Virginia did, but received 20% fewer electoral votes. So it was already disproportionate. In 1796, when Jefferson lost to to Adams, he lost to Adams, he would have won in 1796 if it had been winner take all in Virginia, which it was not. And so came winner take all by 1800. Because they joined with the other states that were going winner take all. So the winner take all was pure pragmatism and saying we got to get in there so that our state benefits, right, from this. And so this idea, the framers never imagined that delegates would be pledged to a party, certainly not, or even pledge to a person. They thought they were going to come and sit in a room, and because they would know all these people and be well informed, and they'd be statesmen, and they would figure it all out, and then they would choose the best person, right, to be the president. And there have been a lot of weaknesses and sort of loopholes that have been revealed for us in this last 6 months during this election process, I think. And there's some things that definitely we need to address. One of the major threats, you guys, that I don't think I've not seen, I haven't really, I mean, there's a Supreme Court case that mentions it, but I haven't seen it really highlighted. Maybe that's okay if we don't tell anybody. Wait, this is being recorded. Well, anyway, here's the thing. There is no protection in the Constitution for popular vote for electors. There's no protection. The original electors were elected by legislatures, and then gradually it became popular. By 1828, everybody did it by popular vote. In other words, the white male property owners that could vote voted for the electors directly, not for the legislature didn't vote for them, except in South Carolina, which didn't do it until after the Civil War. Everybody else did. But if Georgia, for example, wanted to say, there'll be no more popular vote. You can have a popular advisory vote if you'd like to tell us, but the Georgia legislature will choose the electors. That is absolutely constitutionally grounded. The Constitution gives them that right. They control elections. And so that seems like a problem. Yes, Patty. Can you unmute, Patty?
So, yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying is that originally the electors weren't selected the way we do now for who they are going to vote for. They were selected as, you're a wise person who agrees with me and you're going to make up your own mind. So when did that change?
Right away, because it never worked the way it was intended. And that's what we assume that they intended. If you guys read the Federalist 68, which I think Tower sent out, and if you haven't yet, you can read it for next week. That's where it's explained in the Federalist Papers. And it seems pretty clear to me that that's what Hamilton expected, what they expected would happen, is that people would choose the person that they thought would be best. But right away in 96, it started to be factions. Are you for Jefferson? Are you for Adams? It was people, not political parties, but people. And then then the electors said they pledged themselves to it. And now, as you know, it's completely party, in that each party puts up a slate of electors. And you as elector say, yeah, I'm a Democratic elector, I'm a Republican elector, I'm a Libertarian elector, whatever. And so we're voting, when you vote at each state, we're voting for the slate of electors. We're not voting for the person, right? And that's when we get to the faithless elector, which we'll talk about. But does that make sense, Patty? So it never did work. It never worked the way they thought it would. And then people sort of forgot what that was supposed to be and went on, because it's human nature, right? Anyway, if Georgia or some other state, Maine, were to make that decision and say, well, we're going to put that back in our hands again, which is how it was intended by the framers. Now, would that survive a popular challenge? I mean, would people in the state permit it? I don't know. Interesting question. I don't want to find out. But I think it would definitely survive a constitutional challenge, because it's very clear in the language that the legislature controls elections and the selection and the means by which the electors are selected. Which also, by the way, means that it's not unconstitutional to do what's the thing we'll talk about next week, which is the compact, the interstate compact of states that have chosen to become part of a compact to be ruled by the popular vote nationwide. You probably know that, most of you guys. I don't want to get sucked down that, but basically, I'll talk about it more next week. But essentially, it's a way to bypass having a constitutional convention, but yet to get to a popular vote. But it's not subversive. It's completely constitutional, because, again, the legislatures get to choose how their electors are chosen and how they vote. So there's nothing that says the electors have to vote for the popular, except by state law. State law may say that in some states you have to do the popular vote, but it's not in the Constitution. Okay, so the ratification. Ooh, yeah, ratification. If you really want to get into this stuff, which is fun, you should read.
Excuse me. How many states say you have to follow the popular? How many states?
That actually say that part? I don't know. I'm going to get in a moment, though, to the court case, and I'll tell you how many say that the electors have to do that. That they can be punished for not doing it. I'll give you that information, but I don't know that particular thing. You could look that up, and for extra credit, Mark, bring it next week. And I do, as you know, I always tell my students, I own all the points in the world and I want you to have them. So extra credit, I'm all about it for stuff that's not, I wouldn't actually do it anymore because they can just ask their phone. Back when I was teaching, they had to go to a library and open something called a book and find it. And I was totally for that. They'd come back the next day, be eager to tell me what they learned, but I wouldn't do it anymore because it's no fair. Okay, I want to talk about the ratification. Because we don't have the minutes of the Constitutional Convention except what Madison wrote, but we do have them for all the ratification conventions in the states. And it's really interesting to read because they were some battles, you can imagine, about whether or not to approve this brand new thing that nobody asked anybody to do, really. And here it is. And now we've got to deal with it. Okay, so you can see this map. Here are the 13 United States, just to remind you these little things. And look at Maine. They're giving us the whole thing, but or Massachusetts, I should say. Sometimes they don't do it all the way up to the county. But you can see here, here's the ratification vote, 1787 to 1791. This is what it looked like. So here we've got Delaware was first on December 7th. Remember, they came out of convention 1787 September 17th. And by December 7th, Delaware had ratified. Pennsylvania ratified on December 12th, James Wilson. So basically, the Federalist Papers were designed by Hamilton, and he got Madison on with him and John Jay, and they were designed basically to persuade New York to vote for the Constitution, because New York was very divided. They had three political factions, Burr, Clinton, and Hamilton, and they were very divided on this question. Upstate New York was one way and the city was another. And so they were trying to sell it with these papers. So on March 14th, 1778, they started writing these, and they are 85, and they started writing them in October 1787 through May 1788. So almost for whatever, that was almost half a year, 85 essays. John Jay wrote 5, and then he got not to be ill. James Madison wrote 29, and Hamilton wrote 51 of them. Right, when I write, I'm talking about with a feather on a piece of whatever at the end of the day. Unbelievable. Hamilton wasn't all that big excited about this Constitution. He wanted a much stronger national government, but he was loyal to the compromise that had been achieved, and he believed in Republican government. And so he wrote the vast majority of these, and they were published all over the 13 colonies, 13 states. But the old guard, the anti-federalists, some of the founders were writing against it, and they were all published anonymously under Roman names. Publius was the name, the pseudonyms, I should say. Publius was the name of those three writers, and then there was Cato, who wrote against it. There were anti-federalist stuff, letters. It was very exciting to read all of that stuff if you really want to get into it and see the arguments that they were making, some of which were very good, and a lot. The missing Bill of Rights was one of the problems. So the Federalist Papers were never very successful as a propaganda piece, except in New York probably, but they're the more quoted than any other document by the United States Supreme Court in the years since then. They've been quoted because they give an insight into the intention of the people who were there. So that's why they're quoted from that. So you read maybe 68. I just want to quickly lay out what the advantages were as Hamilton thought it was going to be. This group of senior statesmen are getting together. Now I want you to listen to these advantages that are laid out in 68 in the light of what we saw in 2020 and 2021. Because reading this a year ago, reading this even a few months ago was different for me than reading it after what we saw happen in those intervening 2 months. First of all, the electors come directly for the people and from them alone, for that purpose only and that time only. That's still true. It's a pop-up, right? They are just there for that one event. But he thought that avoided a party-run legislature or a permanent body that could be influenced. Now, of course, they're not. Now they're party people, actually, but influenced by foreign interests before each election. So they were worried right off the bat about foreign, remember, Britain, France, Spain, getting their claws into this election. And if it was some standing body, they were worried that they would be influenced by foreign interests. Number 3, Hamilton explained the election was to take place among all the states, not in one central location, so that no corruption in any state, get this, could taint the great body of the people in their selection. So if there was a problem in one state, it wouldn't impact the other states. Now, just today, I listened, I told some of you, a debate about the Electoral College, for Notre Dame sponsored. And the man speaking in favor of keeping the current system, the status quo, he said states are like waterproof compartments in terms of safety. So he said, for example, and this was a very poor choice of example. I don't know why he said it, but he said, so if there's a problem, say in a state like Florida, it doesn't impact the rest of the country. The guy on the other side said, Florida? Can you remember 2000 when there were 36 days in which we litigated about that? So it's not a really good example, and it didn't really quite work that way, right? Over 200 votes in Florida, right? Number 4, the choice was to be made by a majority of the Electoral College. Majority rule is critical to the principles of Republican government. Still true. Number 5, Hamilton argued that the electors meeting in the state capitals were able to have information unavailable to the general public. So they would have information and have this wisdom as well. Now, of course, totally unanticipated social media, also unanticipated the telegraph. In 1845, they had to fix the day of the election because of that. So all the things that changed in terms of what information the public could have, or the electors. Number 6, Hamilton also argued that since no federal office holder could be an elector, none of the electors would be beholden to any presidential candidate. Well, of course, now they are completely committed, right, to a presidential candidate. And never was anticipated that that would be the case, that's even why they're chosen, as opposed to, you wanted independent people. Number 7, another consideration that the decision would be made, listen to this word, without tumult and disorder. I think we had a bit of tumult and disorder. It would be a broad-based one made in various locales where the decision makers could deliberate reasonably, not in one place where decision makers could be threatened or intimidated. We saw a bunch of that definitely happening after the election this year. Number 8, if the Electoral College did not achieve a decisive majority, then the House of Representatives was to choose among the top 5. Ensuring selection of a presiding officer administering the laws would have both ability and good character. Now, I don't know exactly how Hamilton, I think, again, he's placing his trust in these statesmen who've been chosen by the people or by the legislatures of that state, and that would, therefore, they would choose an executive, both ability and good character. He was very concerned about somebody unqualified, but with a talent for, quote, low intrigue and the little arts of popularity, end quote, attaining high office. And he thought this deliberative process would prevent that. So the only serious effort that almost got to the point of eliminating the Electoral College was following the 1968 elections. And that was because George Wallace took a number of electoral votes in that election. He was a third-party candidate, right? He nearly sent the election to the House for the first time since 1876, which would only have been the third time. And so when people realized, oh my God, one state, one vote, that's really bad, that's undemocratic. It was a bipartisan effort on this, and I'll talk later about why it failed. But basically, Richard Nixon supported the elimination of Electoral College. Republicans and Democrats supported it following the 1868 election, but it passed in the House overwhelmingly. It did not pass in the Senate. Okay, so now there were no political parties at the beginning, and Washington in particular was very opposed to parties. All of the framers were against parties. As they saw them, they called them factions. And they'd seen the Whigs and the Tories in England, right? And they saw it as like the Crown and the Parliament. Those were the two parties, the Whigs for the Crown, or for the Parliament, and the Tories for the Crown. And it was corrupt. There was a lot of patronage. All kinds of, when one government got in, they threw everybody out and did all these kind of things. So it was basically very corrupt, and they really were opposed to that and interested in overbearing majority, mischiefs of faction. And he defined a faction in Federalist 10 as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So they felt that the government with the checks and balances, a Republican government, combined with the principles of federalism, which distributes voter rights and the separation of government powers, would countervail against factions, and that the great population in this country and our expanse would make it more difficult to organize a faction, is what he believed, because of these issues. Anyway, so it's important to know that they did not, now parties didn't start right away, but by the 96 election, 1796, we had Jefferson, Madison, and Adams, Hamilton, and they were starting to be called by party names, which we will talk about. So here's the map of the ratification. You see that right here, right? And you can see that it has it on these territories where things, look how big Georgia was, as they claimed, and Virginia and all the rest. It's very interesting how how the geography has changed by the states. Okay, so this is the first. Oh, I wanted to talk about the ratification for a second by telling you how it went, because it was exciting. So 5 almost ratified almost immediately, like I said, December to January. And all of them, the vote was unanimous to support this new constitution. Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, or lopsided in Pennsylvania and Connecticut. So the Federalists, the people in support of the Constitution, were very well organized. They needed 9 states. They said if 9 out of 13 join, we're a country. That's it. So Massachusetts, February 1788, Massachusetts had a heck of a time. And one of the reasons was that John Hancock, one of the major founders, right, a Massachusetts guy, was opposed, strongly opposed. And so he spoke against it at the convention. And the way they got around him, the Federalists, was somebody said to him, you know, John Hancock, there's going to have to be a new president. You've read this document, right? And you are the kind of guy that's very likely to be the new president. The other person is some Virginian, you know, that might have been a general during the war, but it's more likely that John Hancock of Massachusetts, who signed the Declaration of Independence, was such a big name, would definitely be the president. He was like, oh, that is true. I vote yes. And so he brought a bunch of votes along. And so the vote in Massachusetts was 187 to 168 in favor of the Constitution. But they also added to their approval 19 amendments. And one of those was, we have to have a Bill of Rights, plus a whole bunch of other things we want to improve. New Hampshire was the 9th state, 57 to 47, with 12 amendments. Then you got 9 states, you're a country, but you don't have Virginia and you don't have New York. And so you got to have those. And in New York, you've got Hamilton working like crazy and Madison in Virginia working at the conventions, talking, speaking, writing letters to each other. And on June 25th, Virginia passed it. Now, Patrick Henry is at that convention speaking against it, and Madison speaking for it. Wouldn't you love to hear those? It would have been so cool. 20 amendments passed in Virginia, and in New York, 33 amendments passed. It passed in July. And in both of those cases, it passed by 2 or 3 votes. It was that close. And in New York, it was going to fail because New York City was totally for it, and upstate New York was against. And so finally, the New York City delegates said, fine, you don't want to approve this? We're going to be a state by ourselves. We'll join with Connecticut. We'll join with New Jersey. And good luck at getting your products and crops to market down to the port, because it's going to cost you a bunch to cross our border. You're not going to be part of this country, and you're not going to be part of our state. So the people in upstate New York had a second thought and decided they would go with it. And so it passed. Enough people did to make it pass. So that it happened. So in 1789, we got the first election. It happened December 15th through January 10th of 88 to 89. Neither Rhode Island or North Carolina were in the Union yet, so they didn't get to vote. The Electoral College met on February 4th, 1789. George Washington got 69 of 69 votes, unanimous. And their second vote was divided, and John Adams received the second number with 34, and John Jay had 9, and then 1 for a bunch of other little people. The first Congress, other people, not little. The first Congress met March 4th, and Washington was inaugurated April 30th. And after that, March 4th, as we said, was the inauguration day and the beginning of each new Congress. Now, North Carolina finally approved it on November 21st, 1789. They actually had voted a couple of times in other conventions. They voted, get this motion, by a 2/3 vote, they voted to neither accept nor reject at one of their conventions, which must have been very frustrating to the people who were trying to get something done, right? Rhode Island, May 29th, 1790, they'd rejected a convention 3 times before they finally called one and voted. So after 1788, and when he was elected, and then in 1792, George Washington ran for re-election, 132 votes out of 132. He's the only person in our history to get a unanimous Electoral College vote, right? But this time Adams got 70. There are more states now, right? Adams got 77 votes, and George Clinton from New York got 50. So we're kind of beginning to get some factionalizing here. So basically, the Electoral College did not function as the way it intended, even in those elections. And so there was just, these people were beginning to be pledged to various places. So until 1824, 6 states still chose by the legislature. And as I said, in 1832, it was still only South Carolina. All right, so we have here the election of, whoops, I'm sorry, went too far. The election of 1796. That's what I want to talk about. That's our first contested election, 1796. So there's 3 new states, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Vermont was made from New York, as you probably know. I didn't know that they wrote a Declaration of Independence from New York in 1777. They were really mad at New York for all the bad things they were doing. They became a republic. They were independent for those years. Then they joined the Union in 1791. Kentucky in 1792 was made from the District of Kentucky of Pennsylvania, and Tennessee in 1796 from the Southern Territory. So Washington went home. He laid down his thing. And you know what George III said? He could not believe that Washington did this. He said that man is the greatest man in history because he laid down power 2 times, right? After the war, when no general had done that. And then again, after 2 terms, he went home. People thought he would just stay, that it would become, you know, like a monarchy. And some people actually wanted that. But Washington decided to go home. Hamilton, who was out of office by then, actually wrote his farewell address. But there were already major factions inside the government. So Hamilton had been treasurer. They only had 4 cabinet members, right? Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. Jefferson was Secretary of State, and they came to loathe one another and to fight throughout that time. Jefferson spent a lot of his time back home in Virginia. He left in December 31st, 93 to plot. From my perspective, I'm not a big fan of Jefferson. He did a lot of good things, but he was the kind of person who was writing lots of letters. Like he was writing letters all the time to Madison and others, sort of stirring the pot. And he was a very clever politician. But his public picture was, I'm above politics. I'm above politics. I don't get involved in those things. But he was actually a brilliant politician. Anyway, so the Federalists caucus, that's how they chose their nominations. They caucused the ones that were in Congress, and the Federalists chose Adams was vice president of Massachusetts, and Thomas Pinckney from South Carolina. And the Republican Democrats, sometimes called just Democrats, but the Democratic Republicans, anyway, that's Jefferson and Madison, nominated Jefferson from Virginia and Burr from New York, okay? It was a vicious campaign. Adams was accused, there were 300 local newspapers in this country, in that little country, 300 local newspapers, all partisan, all pushing their candidate, their party platforms. There was the idea of being a neutral journalist was not a thing in journalism at all. And they printed all kinds of things. One of the things they said about Adams is he's a monarchist. He wants his son, John Quincy, to marry a princess of Britain so that we can have a royal family. That's one of the things going to happen if you elect Adams. What they said about Jefferson was that he was an atheist. Of course, he was actually a deist, as you guys know, but he was an atheist. And if you elect Jefferson, he will come to your houses and take your Bibles. He will confiscate them, which I thought was interesting, precursor to he's going to come and take your guns, right? This is going to come and take your Bibles. And in fact, the president of Yale University, and of course, you know, all the universities were basically preparing grounds for ministers, right? They were seminaries, essentially. So the president of Yale University sent out a letter to all the alumni of Yale and said, if you vote for Thomas Jefferson, your diploma will be revoked. So I don't think he actually could do that. But anyway, it was a threat because they thought Jefferson was, basically the Antichrist. So the Federalists were mainly, as you can see in the North, there's already a North-South division happening here. And you can see that the Federalists got 1 vote each here, but essentially it's split North-South. So here's the problem, though. Remember, there's no distinction in the Constitution yet between president and vice president, right? It says top vote getter gets to be president, second vote getter gets to be vice president. That's all it said. And so they were trying to figure out how they could be sure that Adams was the president, not Pinckney from South Carolina. He knew he was going to be the vice president. So what happened was that if they voted for both their guys all the way through, then there might be a tie, right? And that would be a problem. So what they did is in the New England, 18 Federalist electors in New England didn't want that to happen. So they didn't vote for Pinckney. Instead, they scattered their second votes around, and the Democrat Republicans didn't do that. And so Jefferson came in second instead of Pinckney. So Adams won and Jefferson came in second. So Adams got 71 electoral votes. What he needed was 70. So he got 1 more than he needed. And Jefferson got 68. Pinckney got 59. Burr got 15. Sam Adams got 11, and somebody else got 7. So basically you can see the North-South and you can see that you've got a problem. You've already got a problem. You got Jefferson who campaigned violently against Adams. They really loathe one another, and one is president, one is vice president. And this is true in some states where they don't have a ticket. And I don't know if Maine has a Secretary of State, right? You don't have a lieutenant governor, you have a Secretary of State, don't you? Yeah, no, yes. And that Secretary of State runs separately. And is that Secretary of State doesn't have to be the same party as the governor, right? I missed Maine history because I went to Catholic boarding school in 8th grade. So I don't actually know the answer to this. Someone could unmute and tell me this.
You are right. We do not have a lieutenant governor. We do have a Secretary of State.
And that person becomes governor if something happens to the governor?
That I don't know.
Well, that's what happens in Oregon. It's what happens in California.
The Secretary of State is elected by the legislature.
Oh. And you don't have a lieutenant governor. Wow, that's interesting. That's homework for next time to find out how that works. But where I know it's Secretary of State, and not for next time, of course, for somebody's phone. But where it happens, it's like you can get, when Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, the lieutenant governor, they run on separate things, was a Democrat. And so Reagan never wanted to leave the state because when he's out of the state, the lieutenant governor got to be in charge. In Oregon, they run separately and they don't have to be the same party. So you can get the same thing that was Jefferson and Adams, and it really became a really bad idea. And I want to say the other thing about this election, which is interesting, is that it's the first record of a faithless elector. So the faithless elector, here is a picture of him. His name was Samuel Miles. And this, I think, is a great object lesson in how the Electoral College never actually worked the way it was supposed to. So he was a retired, he'd been in the office, he'd been a governor, he'd been, not the governor, but he'd been in the Senate, he'd been in the state legislature, and he supported the Federalists, and that's who they thought he was going to vote for. But he thought he should do as the Constitution intended. So he gave his second vote he gave to Pinckney, the Federalist, more or less candidate for vice president. But he did not want to be in a war with France. And he knew that Jefferson was favorable to France and that Adams was more favorable to Britain, and things were heating up over there. It was going to end up in the Napoleonic Wars, right? And so he wanted to stay out of the war. So he chose Jefferson. So he's that one little vote in Pennsylvania for Jefferson. And he was absolutely loathed, and the Federalists were furious at his disloyalty. They had figured he was going to be voting for the Federalists. And this is what Samuel Miles said about his decision. He said, "I thought it was my duty to vote for the man that appeared to me most useful for the public good, without regard to party views." So he was trying to do what he thought he understood from probably the Federalist Papers that his job was. And then one of the letters to the editor that followed this from someone in Pennsylvania to the US Gazette said, "What? Do I choose Samuel Miles to determine for me whether John Adams or Thomas Jefferson shall be president? No, I choose him to act, not to think." Just boom, there you have it right there, right? In a nutshell, in 1796. So over 58 elections since then, 165 electors have not cast their votes for president or vice president as prescribed by the legislature of the state they represented. However, the only time those unpledged electors have actually been elected to the Electoral College was in 1960, which I think is very interesting. 15 unpledged Democratic electors from Mississippi and Alabama. I mean, this is when we still had Southern Democrats, right? 1960. They cast their votes for Harry Byrd, the Southern Democrat, right? Rather than John Kennedy, the National Democrat, the Catholic, who ultimately obviously won the election. So, but they cast their votes. And they actually, that's why it was recorded that way. The practice died out after the 60s when conservative Southerners moved their loyalties to the Republican Party. So their whole idea was the same idea that some of Trump's supporters had, which was trying to get the election to the House. And the problem with all the things that Trump supporters did is they did it after the election, right? Had they been doing some of these things before the election, it'd be interesting to think how that might have played out. But basically, they wanted to get the election to the House, these people, because they thought the House election, the contingent election, might be more favorable to them. So on July 6th, this past July, 5 months before the election, in a case called Chiafalo versus Washington, okay, there was this court case took place. And it was that the Washington, you probably remember this, that in the 2016 election, an elector from Colorado and some electors from Washington state that were Democrats tried to organize a situation in which they would not cast their vote for Hillary Clinton, but would rather cast it for a different Republican, John Kasich or somebody. And they were trying to organize with some other Republicans to see if they could get the election into the House. So their states had laws saying faithless electors can be punished, fined, or even replaced. And so that's the court case that went to the Supreme Court. Justice Elena Kagan wrote the decision, and it was a unanimous decision that said states have the right to punish their electors. Electoral College delegates have no ground for reversing the statewide popular vote. Now, that is interesting because she's used the term popular vote, even though, again, it's whatever the legislature said. The most important thing she said was that the states can have laws saying you will be replaced or you can be fined if you don't follow whatever the state law is. Now, if it had gone the other way, as many of the justices said, it would have been a nightmare. Even the Harvard University lawyer who defended the Chiafalo said he was basically kind of glad that it went the way it did. He said, we took this case because we thought it needed to be resolved before it created a constitutional crisis. Now, Mark, this might help you. 32 states have some sort of faithless elector law, but only 15 of those remove, penalize, or simply cancel the votes of the errant electors. So those 15 states have a hammer in there about following the popular vote. And 32 have some kind of faithless elector, which means they are saying you have to vote the way the popular vote went, is what I'm guessing that is. Maine has no such law. The Secretary of State of Maine did say that they determined that a faithless elector could be removed. So the court decision is so strong, it does allow, this is what people think, it would allow states to remove faithless electors even without a state law. So basically, she's saying, Kagan was saying that that the original Electoral College failed to anticipate the growth of political parties, and that basically after the 1804 amendment, which separated president and vice president, basically party line voting is what's expected, and the justices didn't want to tinker with laws in states that bind the delegates to vote for the popular vote winner in their states. So that was a unanimous decision. She says the elector's constitutional claim has neither text nor history on its side. But I think that she's not, I mean, I think she's kind of, it's pretty presumptuous of me to say that Elena Kagan needs to think differently about Federalist 68. But I do think, she says none of the framers had the idea that a person should be, not bound to vote that way. But I think that they did. But anyway, it's moot now since the Supreme Court has ruled. But here I would argue is that Alexander Hamilton did not imagine a bound elector, as we said, neither by the party nor by popular vote in the state. So I think that we're in a situation now where the states get, just as from the beginning, the states get to determine, and that is what they have done. So Samuel Miles goes down as history as the first faithless elector and not the last. So questions, comments, things, what we're going to do next time, if you're interested and willing to come back, is to, but there are some really interesting elections. 1800 is one. And when we look at that, we're going to have a little bit of Hamilton, little Hamilton song. If you've seen Hamilton, if you haven't, you really need to. And the Hamilton song is called The Ballad of 1800. And it's about that election. And I'm going to play a little bit of that for you. And then we looked at 1824 when it went to the House. The so-called corrupt bargain, and then 1876, which really was the corrupt bargain election. But the election itself in 1876 is what basically happened is that, of course, that was the sellout of Reconstruction in the South. And that was where all the freed Blacks in the South were thrown under the bus by the Republican Party to get Rutherford B. Hayes elected as president. And so they basically condemned all of the free Black citizens to essentially to Jim Crow and segregation for 100 years until Lyndon Johnson in 1964, 65. So it was a terrible bargain, and it is a corrupt bargain, and it's a very fascinating story, the 1876 election. So I want to talk about that, and then talk about the Electoral College, what we can do about it if a person wants to do something about it. There's a history of efforts to change it. As I said, got closest in 1972 and 3. Some of you may remember Birch Bayh, Indiana. He was the leader of that effort, and really a good guy who worked really, really hard, and it got very close. And then we'll see what the options are now, and to what extent there are things to be done, and if something should be done. Maybe people are happy with it the way it is and think it does in fact save the states and we need federalism. That's certainly what the gentleman was arguing today in the debate that I listened to. So we'll see that. Any final comments from anybody?
Susan, I just wanted to say thank you. It's sort of, in an odd way, it's sort of comforting to know that we aren't the most dysfunctional, that there's been dysfunctional government before.
Yeah.
And there's something about that is on the one hand comforting, and on the other hand makes you feel like, are we ever going to fix this problem? So, but it's very interesting to hear about it. And I really appreciate it. This was very energetic, and it was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Remember, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So that's what we have to keep remembering.
Well, Susan, thank you. It was very enjoyable and interesting. As I think back upon the various images you showed us, 3 of them were particularly interesting. The first 2 were when you showed images of a scale. And on one hand, you had the Electoral College protecting the people from the government. And the other hand, you had the Electoral College protecting the government from the people. And that theme certainly has carried over to the present in a lot of political discussion. And even though it's not about the Electoral College. And the other image I thought that was interesting was that you showed a lone pillar separated from a building with 4 other pillars. And the question was the Electoral College a pillar of democracy? And I'm asking myself, and have for some time, what sort of a democracy do we have? Do we have a democracy? And how does the Electoral College relate to our whatever we have? Because certainly there are some people that say we definitely do not have a popular democracy where everybody decides most all of the issues. And we may have a representative democracy where we elect our representatives and they hopefully faithfully represent us. And other people would say, no, we in no way have a democracy. We have a federation of states. And you Democrats better understand that pretty quick.
Well, we did fight it. We fought a little war about that in 1861.
I know, but there's still an awful lot of people out there who tell me personally when I'm discussing this, they say, no, you are wrong, Sweat. We do not have a democracy. We are a federation of states.
Well, they're wrong about that. Technically, we have a constitutional republic. That's the name of it. But that they see it that way, sure, they do again. You're right, Dick. And that was an argument that was had at the ratification conventions, and it's still happening. We are a democracy, but it's imperfect. We are imperfect, but we are going to be more perfect when we finish this course. And so I appreciate you all coming. And next week, Tara just wrote, same time, same place. I hope that you'll all be back. Otherwise, it really will just be Stithams, but that's okay because I know you have to come back.
April 8th.
That'll be good.
April 8th, 6 p.m. Thank you so much, Susan. You're fantastic. This was awesome. And I look forward to hearing about what we can do.
Right. Well, here's the other thing I want to say. People could come next week who didn't come today.